Carrying on from the topic in our last lesson, one of the major ways that we use events is when we're working with user input, particularly in working with forms. So we're going to look specifically at the different form widgets as a sort of review for how we work with forms, and then we'll look at the events that are relevant to each of them. So first of all, it's officially time to talk about how we properly configure the form tag. You might have learned about the form tag in previous classes, but we've probably already talked about them in terms of a tip of the iceberg kind of situation. Now we get to kind of dig into that iceberg a little bit, in that we are actually doing some programming now, and some of the relevant things or things that relate to how we configure form tags are actually relevant. So the form tag itself is useful for a variety of things, and it allows us to configure these things in specific, all related to the data. That is, which data to begin with. So the form tag should wrap around all the fields that make up a particular data set. One of the mistakes I often see in Web 1 is folks put a form tag around every single field that they're marking up, when in reality that's definitely overkill, because most of the time we have a set of data, a bunch of fields that we want to complete and then submit them all at once and let all that data be packaged at once and sent to the server. So therefore, we want to wrap a form tag around the entire set of data, one single tag that opens before the first field and closes after the last field. In most cases, you're going to have just one form on a page, and so it's pretty normal to have just one opening and closing form tag. But suffice to say that sometimes you need separate forms because you have separate sets of data you're submitting. It's much more normal to just have one form tag on your page. The second thing that we can dive into is where to send the data. This is something that we would have overlooked altogether in Web 1 because this kind of information was irrelevant for what we were doing. We were really trying to just mark up content. And now we can actually think about functionality. So when you package up that data, when you contain a set of data inside of a form, when the user clicks submit, something is going to happen with that data. And with JavaScript, we can do some processing on the front end. And in fact, there are whole JavaScript frameworks that deal with a completely front-end application. But the longer trend in history is to have a server-side script that will receive that data. And you'll get to look at a server-side script in our demo today. Server-side scripts are simply scripts that are written in technologies that require a web server to process them. Technologies like PHP and C#, .NET, and others of this sort. Python is another example. The idea here is that they're different in nature. They can't just run in a browser. They have to first be interpreted by a server and some specific technology, and then sent to the browser in a different form. So this is how, in very broad strokes, a server-side script would receive data from our form and process it. That technology is what enables that to happen, that is. So where to send the data is a matter of knowing which server-side script is going to receive this data. It's basically a file or a URL. So the action attribute is what we allow, or what we have available for us to provide the path to that processing script. So you'll see this, where it's basically a path. It might be in the same folder. It might be on a different server. It just depends. And last of all, how to package the data. So we actually have the option to send data in many different formats using the HTTP system. That's the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's what you've seen at the beginning of each of the web addresses that you've copied and pasted, how they start with http://. We're just prefixing our web address by saying, hey, by the way, we're using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol for this. Well, this is responsible for most of the web interactions you have on a daily basis, and little did you know that every request you make for a web page is packaging some data with that request and receiving some data back from the server, All of that thanks to the HTTP technology. So when we provide the method attribute, we can set it to get or preferably to post in order to package our form data in the most appropriate way. So get and post are just two examples. There are several different verbs, and we'll look at a few of other ones a little bit later in our course. But get and post are the common ones for dealing with server-side scripts and form data. All right. Here's a little bit more about each of those. We can send data to the processing script using get or post, as we talked about on the previous slide. On the get side of things, the data in the form is serialized. That means it's collected and kind of converted into variable value pairs, where the field name is assigned the value that you put into that field as the user. So that serialized data is encoded as URL variables and passed with the URL request for the processing script. You'll get to see what this looks like, but it basically means that the values are visible in the browser address bar on the following page that make this less secure. There are times where this is very handy, but it's generally not what we do with most of the forms that we're working with. Instead, we prefer the post method. This is where serialized data is encoded in the head of the HTTP request that is sent to the processing script. In other words, it's not put into that URL itself. It's sent in kind of a more technical component of this request that's sent off, something called the head of the request, and therefore it's not visible to you as the user, kind of in a front-end way, like URL variables would be. So this means the variables are hidden from view and thus more secure. All right, so bottom line, post is what we're typically going to set this to, but I wanted to expose you to the idea that get can also be used. All right, now we're going to move on to looking at how we label data, and then a few common form widgets, and then we'll switch over and do some experimentation with all of the things we've talked about so far. So with labeling data, the best practice when working with forms is to pair any form field with a label. I kind of worded it opposite there in the bullet. But basically every form field that you put in, it's a best practice to have a corresponding label for that. So we'll get to look at examples of those in the demo file. And on these labels, we set the for attribute to match the corresponding field's ID attribute. This is a way of pairing that label with that field by way of that unique ID attribute. We also make sure that all IDs, therefore, all fields have a unique ID attribute. Each individual field, so that means every different text input, every different radio button, even radio buttons that are part of a set, they all need to have their own unique ID attributes in order for us to really work with them well. And all data field groups have a unique name attribute. However, notice that this is fields / groups. So most of the time, you can assume that each of your form fields need to have a unique name, as in different one from the other. The exceptions are the field groups like radio button sets, checkbox button sets. In those cases, when you put the same name attribute on a two or more radio buttons, they act as a set. And with radio buttons, that means that only one of them can be selected at one time. If you put 2 radio buttons in and you don't get the functionality that you expect, where they only one of the 2 is turned on, and if you switch the other, the first one becomes unselected. If that isn't happening for you, it may be that you have mismatched names. They both need to have the same name attribute in order for them to be grouped as a pair. All right, so we'll get to look at those. So now a reminder of the actual form fields or form widgets. We have the following widgets listed down the left column, and a reminder that most of these we create using the input tag, and we set its type attribute to a specific value. Now, so you can see that, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these fields can be created with the input tag, and 3 of them cannot be created with the input tag. The text area, the select drop-down list, and the selection list options. Those all need specific tags, but all the rest, of course the miscellaneous button is the one kind of strange exception. Those all can be created with input with a type set to text for single line text, password for password text, submit for submit buttons, reset for reset buttons, radio and checkbox, etc. But what I've also shown you in this chart is that some of those buttony types of fields can also be created with the button tag. So notice that the submit button, the reset button, and a miscellaneous button can be created with the button tag. So if you have a button in your form, something that actually both looks like a button and functions in the way of committing an action in some way, like a submit button or a cancel button, I recommend that you use the button tag as opposed to the input tag with the type set to submit or reset or something like that. This helps both you and future coders of your same page recognize more quickly that what you're dealing with is a button. And then that means that what you've left the other fields to is just the normal input types. And of course, radio buttons and checkboxes are going to be a little bit of an exception to that idea. But just make sure that if you use the button tag that you set the type to be the appropriate type. So your actual submit button needs to have a type of submit. A miscellaneous button in your application can just be a button tag. It doesn't have to have any type set on it. Okay, so study this chart a little bit to review the different field types, noting that we really have the input tag with a bunch of options for the type. We have the button tag with a few instances where we have a type set, and then we have the three other tags: text area, select, and option. And its select tag is going to group a set of options that make a drop-down list. All right, so next we're going to talk about jQuery, so let's switch over and look at our demo first for an opportunity to review what's going on here. So the instructions here prompt you, guide you through some activities that you might want to do. I'm going to kind of breeze through this, but I encourage you to spend a little bit of time on each of the questions that are prompted here to just kind of get to know things. But we're starting in the index vanilla.html, and if we preview this in the browser, make note that we want to actually use a different option from this dropdown. We want to use the box URL. Because we actually have server-side script that we're going to be running, and if we use the static options, that script won't run correctly. So make sure you don't just drop down and choose, project static, but that you go to box URL. And also, this has landed us on our index.html file, so you want to make sure you put in index-vanilla.html to get to the script we're looking at right now. This is the unstyled version of the form that you should see. And what I wanted to use this to do with you was to just give you as simple as possible an example form where you can see the form tag is wrapping around all of the fields. It basically encompasses most of the contents of the body tag. All right, and we have set the action pointing to submit.php. That means that this data, when we submit the file, this data is going to be packaged together and sent to this little guy over here, submit.php. So here you can see a little bit of server-side code. If you have taken Web 2 and done some work in WordPress, this little PHP tag might be an unwelcomed guest, but really it's actually very helpful and PHP does lots of cool things. This is a very simple PHP script. I'm not going to take the time to explain what's going on here. Feel free to poke around at it as you see fit. But this is the file, the server-side script that we talked about we might be using. That's what this action is pointing the data to be submitted to. And we have this set to the get method so that we can make a point of showing you what the get and post methods look like. So over here in our preview, let's take a look. Let's take a moment to fill some things in here. So hi, my name is Phil Shanley. I'm requesting apply. Of course, what am I? Oh, I'm 30 or older. Alas, and here we go. Hi, please write me back, man. Write me back. All right, so notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 fields all in all, and I've provided a value for each of them. So when we click send, take a look at what this server-side script is showing us. Now, this is something that I've written, and we're really keeping this simple. This is not necessarily to prescribe that this is what all submit scripts look like. In fact, you've dealt with zillions of submit scripts in your life, and probably none of them looked exactly like this. This one is particularly rigged to show you what fields you submitted. And so we can see that we use the get method. We provide the name Phil Shanley, the reply to yes, the age of 30 up, message, hi, please write me back. I'm not sure why send is looking like this. We've probably got something more to look at there. But anyway, you can see those 4 fields that we submitted. So what is name, reply, age, message? Where are those things coming from? Because we know where these came from. These came from the options we submitted. But if you look back over at our form, those values, name, reply, age, and message, correspond to the name attributes that we set here. Name, reply, age, message, and send. All right? So that's why we get those values. So if I change one of these, let's go up here and change name to name Z, save. I'm going to go back to my script and refresh it. I'll have to put my form field data in again. Just kind of go with the same things. We click submit this time. Look at how that name Z is what came through. So if you were concerned or confused that it might be the ID attribute, you can clearly see the ID attribute stayed at name, and the name attribute was set to name Z, and now it's reverted. Okay, so we get the name attribute is what is providing the kind of the key for the value that is being submitted to the database. You can see that same little bit of information up here in the address bar. So this is what we were talking about when we mentioned URL variables. So here is the domain, here is the file, and then the question mark, and beyond begins the URL variables. So remember we had name Z was one of our fields. It's being assigned Phil Shanley. So this plus sign, this is called URL encoded data. So when we convert our data into URL variables, it gets encoded with things like the plus sign that help it be a valid URL. Then the ampersand separates this name value pair from the next one. Okay, so that is the name and its value. And then here's the next field, reply and its value. And the next field, age and its value, etc., etc., etc. All right, so that's what we're talking about with URL variables. And so while we used get, we delivered the data successfully, but we can see all of our variables up here, which is both not so secure and kind of becomes impractical. Why do we need all that stuff up there in the browser bar? Imagine if we had somebody who wrote me, like a 5,000 word essay in this submit form. That makes for a pretty unwieldy URL. Yeah, so we don't need that. So let's switch it to the post method. We're going to want to go back and refresh so that we get that change. So now if I put my data in, I am requesting a reply. We send it this time. We do not have those URL variables. We have used the post method, so that data has been packaged in the head of the HTTP request, and therefore it is hidden. All the better if we were using a secure connection, HTTPS, it would also be encrypted so that it's also kind of scrambled letters and would need to be decrypted. That makes it all the more secure. So a little bit about how that get dealio works now, having looked at those. So the other thing I wanted to point out is how the radio button fields have matching names, reply and reply. So if we go back to this guy and we refresh, that default functionality means that they toggle. Okay, but if I make an oops and I give these guys 2 different names, reply and reply to, they're no longer paired. Turns out I can select both and I can't get rid of the selection. That's kind of annoying. So it's okay for their IDs to be different, reply yes and reply no. That makes these 2 uniquely identified, but the name needs to be the same in order for them to be seen by the browser as a set. Okay, here's the example selection box, the drop-down list that you've seen, and there's the multi-line text, the text area. Last of all, here's the button for the submit that causes that submit action. Okay, so feel free to play around with these a little bit more to just be refreshed on how forms work. But let's carry on and talk about how we actually work with form values and treat them differently with jQuery. So jQuery, again, is our good buddy, gives us all kinds of things, valuable things to do. And so if we have a user working with a form and we want to kind of be doing something with the data that they're entering as they go, or even at some particular point when they've made some changes, we can read a field's value. Oh yeah, field values. I guess I need to actually talk formally about the field values themselves. So let's just switch back and take a peek at this in the, nope, let me talk about it first and then we'll look at it in the browser. So note that the input and option tags use the value attribute to set a preset value. That is the value that is going to be kind of populated into that thing by default. So with an input, this means the value you're going to see in a single line text input, or the value that's actually submitted with a radio or checkbox button, since you don't actually see really its value. The text area and buttons, on the other hand, use their inner content to provide a preset value. So let's just take a peek at that really quickly to just kind of connect what I'm talking about there. So let's say we wanted to pre-populate some value into this field right here. We could go in here and see value attribute is empty right now. If we put something in here, then that is what's going to appear by default. It's different from placeholder text. That's a different concept. This is actually the value. So if I submit this right now, I'm going to get that value coming through. Okay, but notice that if I don't have anything selected from the dropdown, and notice that there's a default selection here. If I just submit this as is, I do get something, but it doesn't look exactly like the dropdown itself. It's got this under -18. That's because the option here allows you to provide sort of a back-end version of what the user is seeing. So the practice is make this part here very user-friendly and pretty, but make the value here something that's much more practical for your server-side script to process. So it's often that we'll just use a number, to represent or kind of encode this idea of under 18. So the topic for another day. Setting all this up is something that you'll be doing closely in partnership with a developer who probably understands the way the database is set up for this. So that's something to touch on more if you're interested in going that direction with your skills. But just making the point that there's a difference between what we encode here as the value and what we place inside the tag as kind of the label. Same thing goes for the radio buttons. They have a value of yes and no. So if I have no radio button selected, notice that I didn't have one selected and I don't see the field come through at all. So as opposed to with the selection drop-down list, one of them is kind of pre-selected and will always get populated. But it's possible that you haven't chosen an option, and if you don't choose an option, you don't see it over here. You actually have to turn one on to see that come through. So there's the reply field and the yes value. If I go back and change it to no, no is what comes through. Okay, so value attributes on the input fields and on the option fields are what actually encode the values. On the other hand, in text areas, if I want to pre-populate a value, here is your starter message. I put that between the tags like a normal, kind of opening tag, closing tag, content in between kind of deal. So that is actually the value that if I wanted to change it, I can. But if I left it at its initial point, that is what would be sent to the processing script. Okay, so that's how you would physically put a value into a field. But JavaScript is all about allowing us to do things in a less than physical way, right? We can kind of do it ourselves through the powers of the kind of dynamic processing that we have with JavaScript. So you can read a field's value by selecting that field and then adding the .val. If you want to actually write a value into that field or populate it with some particular value, you again select the field called .val, but this time you pass the desired value in as a string. So this is similar to what we've seen already with the text method and with the HTML method and with the attribute method. Each of those allowed us to read a value just by calling that method, and also to write a value by calling that method and then passing something into the parentheses there. So let's take a look now at actually working with values in this form. So first of all, we want to switch out of our vanilla version here that's just nice and clean to our formatted version. And so this is really the same form, but there's just Bootstrap classes on here that are doing a lot of the formatting. There's just a hair more structure. There's a div around each of the inputs. Some things that we really would like to not have to do, but boy, Bootstrap sure makes it pretty looking and saves you some time from your styling. And a little div isn't the end of the world. So for quickly mocking up a design, I find this quite helpful. So again, to preview this, we're going to want to make sure that we drop this down and do box. Oops, that's the wrong button. Drop this down and choose box URL, and that should land you right on your main homepage, the index.html. And you can see it looks a little more pretty. We get a styled drop-down box, and we get some neat-looking widgets here. So that's all we did by switching over here. We've also got jQuery, and oh, actually we don't yet. So let's get jQuery attached. So we need the Google-hosted libraries, and we're going to go find our jQuery Google-hosted library jQuery file. jQuery, let's grab 3x. All right, now we've got jQuery in there, and we'll add our own little script tag so we can do some magic, put the DRE in, and we're ready to go. So, in the provided DRE, sorry about that. No, oh, I see. You know what? I'm working in the wrong place. Maybe it is already over here. Yep, there it is. All right, so disregard that. Here we are. In the provided DRE, select the single line text box and read its value. All right, so we want to select it. We could select an input tag, but boy, if we want this one specific input tag, what's the most appropriate way to select a very specific thing? Well, to use its ID, right? So we're going to select the thing that has an ID of name. Okay, and we're going to read its value. So reading its value is a matter of calling name.val. Okay, so that has accomplished the task. I want to see it in the console, so I'm going to console log that very thing just by wrapping console log around this. Okay, so if I refresh, well, that's pretty boring. There's nothing to see. Console.log name val refresh. Yeah, there's no value in there, so that's kind of not exciting. Well, let's check what happens if we change to one of our radio buttons. What's one of our radio buttons IDs? Reply-yes. So let's see its value. Oh yeah, so there it is. The value attribute is yes. Okay, and let's try once again for the drop-down box. Its value is, or its ID is age. All right, so if we refresh, we should see that default selection of under 18. Okay, so we've read some values. There you have it. Now let's try modifying some values. So for example, let's try to write a value into that single line text. So that was the name field. And we don't need to console log anymore. We're not trying to read the value anymore. So I'm pulling out the console log. But now if I want to populate a value, if I want to write a value into it, I'm going to pass something into the val method here, like Phil Shanley. Okay, so there's nothing there. I refresh. JavaScript writes that value in. Now I could still change it. Phil Shanley II. And that, now we're out of sync. JavaScript doesn't know particularly that I've made that change. If I refresh, it rewrites back to what I told it to write. All right, let's select the drop-down list and change its value from to one of the existing values. So here we are, here's the selection list. So we're going to select the thing with an ID of age, and we're going to pass its value one of the other existing values. So let's try 30 and up. So this gets a little bit more interesting. So watch how now by default it was selected on under 18, but when I refresh, I now have JavaScript changing the value, so the selected option actually changes to 30 and older. So that's kind of nice that it does that. Okay, so you've now seen how to read values and how to write values. Feel free to practice a little bit more by trying to populate some values into these fields. But keep in mind all along that we're not actually in any capacity where we can make changes and our script recognizes that in any way. It's only loaded that one time, and then we're done. So if we populate it in at the beginning and change it locally, we're not getting any read back in the console. So it's a good transition to switch back over here and do our last slide that talks about form events. So bring up in your mind what we were doing in the last lesson where we were doing a whole bunch of listening for click events. Well, that was pretty helpful. There's lots of things we can do because clicking is one of the major ways that users interact with our pages. But another kind of interaction comes through forms. So we have a whole series of events that can happen on any one of our form fields. Focus is when they click into a field. Blur is when they click away or tab away, regardless of whether they've actually changed that field. So we can have an event happen right when they focus on it, and again, right away, instantly when they move away from it. We can also listen for an actual change on that field. And so change is kind of similar to blur in that it happens when the user has moved away from that field, but it only is registered if they actually made a change to the content. So if you focus on a field, don't make any changes, and then move your focus away, you would trigger a blur event, but not a change event. If you focus on a field, make a change, and then move away, at the instant you move away, you would trigger both a blur event and a change event. So important to note that the change occurs when you move away or kind of make a final selection on a field. Input, on the other hand, is a little bit more real time. Input happens as the user enters or edits content in a text field. So input would be called for every keystroke inside of a text field, for example. And of course, submit is the event that the form registers when the submit button is clicked. So this is a little trick to get to remember. If you want to listen for a submit event, you need to listen on the form itself, not on the button that the user clicks to submit. And another common thing that people do is they'll listen for a click event on the submit button rather than on a submit event for the form. And remember that there are many ways that a form can be submitted beyond clicking a submit button. People can press return, and certain text screen readers have different commands for submitting form data. So submit is the safer way to make sure that you call something when the form is submitted, as opposed to just listening for a click on the submit button. But that's also how a submit can be triggered. Okay, so let's move over and do some practicing with this idea. So over here, we're going to respond to some form events. So add an all-in-one event handler is what I mean there, that responds to a change event on the drop-down field. So we're going to select that drop-down field and listen for a change. So here is the drop-down field. That is the age drop-down, right here, ID of age. And on a change, we're going to call a function. Look familiar from the last lesson? So what are we going to do with that? As a result, log the field's current value. So when that event is triggered, we're just going to console.log that field's value. So that field is the e.target, and we want to convert it into a jQuery object so that we can call its val. So let's take a look. So age. So if I change it, we get a message. If I change it back to the default, we get a message. If I'm here, but I don't actually change it, look, I didn't get that or any repeat on this. But if I do come back in and change it to 30 under, good. So you can see the change event in play there. All right, now let's add an all-in-one that responds to input events on the single line input field. So this is going to be the name, and on input events, we're going to call a handler. And what do we want to do inside that handler? Log the field's current value. So here we go. We're going to log, and this is going to get pretty exciting because remember the input event is triggered every time we make a keystroke change. So here we are. So you see as I type, it gets very exciting, even as I go back and change things. So we're getting a log every keystroke, which is pretty cool. All right, but also can be a little troublesome, so we have to watch out for some issues there. But all right, now we're going to add an all-in-one that responds to a submit event on the form itself. So remember, submit event is on the form as a whole, not on the submit button. So submit event function, passing in the event, and we're going to make sure we select the right thing. How do we select this form? Well, having an ID would be ideal. So form, contact, and that's an ID. I like that. Okay, so now we're going to practice with this idea of pausing the default behavior, because maybe we want to do some processing on this form before we send it off to that server-side script. Maybe we want to validate that they provided a valid name, or that they actually made a selection here with the yes and no, since that's, we found that it's possible for you to not select something and therefore get no value on the other side. So inside here we want to call e.prevent default, and you'll see now that the submission is blocked. Okay, we can click done all we want, and the script is never sent to the server because we've paused it. So not really a best practice to just leave it like this, but nonetheless you see how we can actually cause that to happen. All right, I think you've got enough to go on now to jump in on the exercise. This is going to be a complex exercise, but I wish you the best, and we'll look forward to hearing from you if you need any assistance.